is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Irene Feinman Kraus. We're here in Johannesburg.
Hello everybody. I was born in Holland to a Hungarian father and an English mother. And we were traditional, we were not religious, we were traditional. We had Friday nights, we went to shul on the high holidays, but we were not, as they say, religious. My father was one of 12, my mother was one of 10. And although both came from religious families, my parents were not religious. Maybe they'd had too much when they were younger, I don't know. But we had a very happy and a nice home life. And we mixed with everybody, with Jews, with the Catholics, with Gentiles. I went to a nursery school and everybody played with everybody. And it was a good life. And then one day when I was ready to go to school, my mother said, "No, you're not going to nursery school today, Irene." And I said, "Why?" And you don't tell a 6-year-old why. She says, "No, you just don't have to go, don't worry. You stay home." So I stayed home, and the next day the same thing. And because of course the Jews, it was like a net being put around you. You couldn't go to the park. You couldn't go to the canals, you couldn't go to a movie, you couldn't ride your bicycle, you couldn't listen to the radio, you couldn't go to the shops except at a certain time. And when you did get to the shops, this applied to Jews, there wasn't that much left. So life was difficult, but as a child, I can't say I felt it because I was with my family. And then one night in 1942, I'll never forget the date, it was September the 16th, the banging on the door. I don't remember if they smashed the door because the back door had a glass panel. And it was the Dutch Nazis, not German Nazis. They came in and they said, "You have 10 minutes to pack a little suitcase and then you coming with us." Now, a lot of people had been taken away. We were in Rotterdam, by the way, and people knew that it was happening, but my mother had the suitcase packed ready. And I still remember she put as many clothes on me as she could, a jersey and a coat and this and that and little hat and gloves, because we didn't know where we were going, and you wouldn't be able to get clothes wherever you were going. And she put all these clothes on me, and we walked with the suitcase. We walked and walked and walked, I think through the night, and we got to a warehouse in Rotterdam, and everybody was sitting on the stone floor. And we spent the whole night there. And the next morning a train came, an ordinary train, we were still in Holland, and took us to a place called Ravensbruck. That was a transit camp on the German-Dutch border. And from there, from that camp, people were sent on to the other camps. Now, Ravensbruck, for me, when you're a kid, you don't see ugly things. It was in the moors, it was muddy, there were wooden barracks, but at least we were together. The barracks were big. One half of the barracks had sheets, and the boys and the fathers were on that side, and on the other side were mothers and their daughters. And there were wooden tables in between. There was a big stove where you could eat. Now, you could get parcels, and there was food, not a lot of food, but it wasn't a concentration camp, it was a transit camp, and there is a difference. Now, they took Jews from all over Holland, and literally the good, the bad, and the ugly. There were all kinds of people there, and thieves included, And my mother was a school teacher from England, and she was told, everybody had a job, she was told that she must teach. Of course, she spoke Dutch, so she taught the younger children. My father, I don't quite remember what he did, but he was not a well man at that stage already. He suffered from ulcers, and gallbladder. Now, they had everything at this camp. They had hospitals. There was an orchestra. There was entertainment because the Jews from all over had come. So there was always something, and every Saturday night there was a big concert. Now, the little ones, like me, now the camp was built for German Jews who came into Holland, and they didn't come into the cities. I don't know why, but they were very bitter about it, these teenage boys. But they took us little kids, and I remember we sat on the ground, never mind there was mud and all that, and they told us about a wonderful place called Palestine. And the sky was blue and the sun was shining and there were trees, and they taught us songs. They taught us Hebrew songs, Dutch songs, German songs, Yiddish songs. I'd never heard Yiddish in my life. My father, being Hungarian, Hungarians don't speak Yiddish. They learn German at school, like in South Africa you learn Afrikaans. So my father could speak German, Hungarian, English, and what else? Of course, and Dutch. 4 languages, okay. So they taught us all these songs, and to this day, and I'm in my 80s now, I have never forgotten any of those songs. I remember every single word off by heart, every one of those songs. So for me it wasn't an unhappy time. But the thing is that every Tuesday a train used to come. When I say a train, I don't mean an ordinary train. They were cattle trucks, which we'd never seen before. And in the front of the train there was a big sign that said Auschwitz. We didn't know what Auschwitz was. Who knew? And when people asked the commandant, what's going on, he says, no, people are going to go to a work camp. They're going to the east. He didn't say Poland. Going to the east, and if people work hard, you'll be fine. It's only afterwards, years later, that I realized that if it was a work camp, why take old people? Why take cripples? Why take mothers with babies? Why take little children? And everybody was pushed into these trains. And everybody promised to write. Did you get a letter? We never got a letter because it was a one-way trip. And of course, nobody wanted to go on the train. But 1,000 Jews every Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock were piled onto these trains. And the crying the night before and the screaming, it was too terrible. But everybody knew that eventually they would be. Now, because my father was Hungarian and my mother was British born, upon her marriage, she became Hungarian because you took on your husband's nationality, and my brother and I were also considered Hungarian. Now, Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so there was a sort of I won't say a bond, but the Jews in Hungary were only taken away in 1944. We were taken away in 1942. And for some reason that I will never know, we went by an ordinary train to Germany. And that's my mother, my brother, and myself. On the 3rd of February, we were taken away, and my father, who was one of 9 brothers and 1 sister, my father and 3 of his brothers were sent on also an ordinary train to a place called Buchenwald, which was a horrendous camp. And of the 4 brothers that went there, only 1 came back. My father sadly was not one of them. But we didn't know then that people weren't coming back. And when I think of it to this day, it's always worried me that I never had a chance to say goodbye. It's worried me all my life. Anyway, and then we were taken and we arrived at this camp, Ravensbruck, which is the largest women's camp in Germany. Just to give you an idea, 93,000 women died there. It wasn't a camp for Jewish people. Most of the people were not Jewish. There were a number of Jews, but not that many. And when we arrived at night, and it was horrendous. All you saw was these high walls. There were searchlights all around. There were electric fences, and there were, what do you call it, men who sits on the wall with guns.
It was the guards, with
Yes,
the searchlights.
What do you call it? I can't think of
Snipers,
their
maybe
name.
snipers.
No, well, yes, they were all around the camp. And, with the bright lights and everything, and we were all herded in to like one large barrack. And a barrack, by the way, held 600 people. And there were these three-tiered ghastly bunks. But before we got to there, in this barrack, people were given proper uniforms. They were given the striped uniform, the grey and the navy stripes. The women got a cotton dress, a little cotton jacket, and they got clogs, wooden clogs. They used to throw the clogs. Sometimes you got 2 left feet, sometimes you got 2 right feet. They weren't worried about your comfort. And they had a little doek on their heads. But because I was small, I was not given a uniform. And I was still wearing the same clothes I wore when we left Holland. In fact, I wore those clothes for 3 years, the same shoes and the same clothes, and I've had bad feet all my life since then. But at least I wasn't cold, because I had the little jersey and I had the coat. And then there were German guards sitting at the table, and there was a big bowl, and the women had to take off their wedding rings. And I remember my mother was very upset. And of course, if anybody had any jewellery, it had to go into this bowl. And then we were herded into the barracks. And when I walked into the barrack, it's like yesterday, I screamed and screamed. I've never seen such a horrible sight in my life. All these emaciated women with no hair. I'd never seen anyone without hair. And their cheeks were sunken and their eyes were big. And we didn't have our head shaven. If your hair was clean, it wasn't. And my mother had a little comb that she brought from Holland, which we still had. And I remember she always combed my hair. So my mother and myself, we didn't have our heads shaven. And we saw all these women, and they wanted to keep touching my hair. And they were dirty, and there was a smell of body odor, of feces, of urine, and it was just ghastly, absolutely ghastly. And every time they wanted to touch me, I screamed. Anyway, we went to the front of the barrack, and there were some Czech people there from Czechoslovakia. They were very, very nice. And everybody got like a metal bowl, no knife and fork. What was there to cut? And a spoon and a mug. And they poured something called Gemüse, which is the German for stew. And the smell of it and the smell of the people, I couldn't eat it. I thought I was going to be ill. And I said to my mother, I only spoke Dutch, I didn't speak English. And I said to my mother, I can't eat this. And before you could say Jack Robinson, one of these other people pulled the bowl away and poured it into her bowl. And one of the Czech women said to my mother, tell your little girl, there is no fridge here. There is no pantry. There's nowhere she can get anything else to eat. If she doesn't eat this, she'll get nothing until tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock in the morning. So I had nothing to eat. Well, you can go one night without anything to eat. And then the beds, you slept head to toe, like if your head was there, and then I slept this way with my head where your feet were, like that. So there were 4 or 5 people on this narrow bunk, and everybody was given a blanket, which was riddled with lice. You could see the lice all over. And people, because, well, you couldn't move. If one person turned over, everybody had to turn over. It was a way of keeping warm, I suppose. And the next morning at 5 o'clock in the morning, now this was in February, Germany is very, very cold. It can get to below 20 below. And people were standing there with their little cotton dresses in the freezing cold. And the guards, the women guards, were in nice warm uniforms with boots, and they all had a little whip. And they had to count people. You stood in rows 5, 5, 5, like that, and they counted people. If they thought somebody was missing, they went into the barrack and they pulled them out. If they were sick or if they were dead, that was too bad. They pulled them out. And the sight of people being whipped and beaten was something in my nightmares still. But my mother was clever. She didn't want me to see this, although when I first got there I did see. So she took her hands like this and she put them over my eyes, and then she put her thumb in my ear so that I wouldn't see and I wouldn't hear. Because they had dogs, big Alsatian dogs, who used to go and go for the throat. But it was the being whipped in the face and the screaming, and it was just horrendous.
I mean,
but
how old were you at this time?
Then I was 7.5. But my mother was unbelievable. Here's a picture of my mother as she looks. This was about...
Very beautiful.
She was a lovely lady altogether. This is about, I don't know, 8, 9 years after the war, in South Africa already. And so she stopped me from seeing these things. And she tried to always, if she could help anybody or do anything for anybody, she did. And to take people's mind off, she had a great love of the English language, and she used to recite poems, never mind they didn't understand it, Byron and Keats and Shelley and all the English poets. And she used to talk about the beauty of the English countryside and the flowers, and, just to get people's mind off this horror. Just to, and other people used to swap recipes because everybody was hungry, and they used to talk how this one made that and the other one made this, and you could talk but just not loud. And I mean, there are people who, I know that this one woman, she was, if I was a little girl, she was about 9 years older than me, and she came to visit us one day in South Africa. And she said to my mother, I have never forgotten, not that she understood English, she said, I have never forgotten the poems that you used to read to us. And when she got married, and her daughter, of course, didn't speak English, but she told her about my mother's love of poetry. This girl went to Ireland and she studied English literature because of the influence my mother had on her mother. So, everybody, had to cope in whichever way they could. And
can I ask, were there other children in the camp?
Yes, there were, but they kept people together. For instance, we were considered Hungarians, so we were with the Hungarians. But I would say that 80% of the people there were Polish. And the Polish people who were there were worse than any German. They used to spit at us Jewish children. Spit in your face and say something rude in Polish like, you bloody Jew, or you dirty Jew, or something like that. They were shocking.
And they were prisoners themselves.
They were prisoners themselves. They were taken in to be slave labourers to work. And they were anti-German, obviously. A lot of the Poles were anti-German. But as anti-German as they were, their biggest hatred was against the Jews. I remember once reading a quote by the late Menachem Begin, as you know, who was the Prime Minister of Israel. He was Polish. He said that the Poles sucked in anti-Semitism with their mother's milk, and he wasn't wrong. That is, the hatred was awful. Meanwhile, there were people there from 23 different countries. the Russians were very nice, the Czechs were nice, the French were nice. I don't remember all the other nationalities, but the nicest of all were the people from Czechoslovakia. Because if they were in charge of dishing up the food, you got a proper portion. And I must explain the food to you. For breakfast, you got one slice of bread, one. And you got like a nail full of margarine and like a teaspoonful of jam that you could smear on the bread. And then you got coffee, which was called ersatz. I don't know what ersatz is in English, but it wasn't real coffee. It was made from acorns, but it was hot. That was breakfast. And on that, people had to go out to work the whole day. Now, my mother was I'm not a tall person. My mother was smaller than me. And her job was laying sleepers for the railways. You know, a whole lot of women would carry these sleepers and lay it. And nobody had lunch. They had a half an hour break and just to rest, and then they came back at like 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, and then they were given this ghastly soup. Now, with the soup, it came in like it looked like a big drum. And there were supposed to be vegetables in it. Turnips, beetroot, which I don't eat to this day, turnips or beetroot. And it was cattle feed. And it was cut into little pieces and put into the soup. Now, if they would have stirred the soup, some of the vegetables would come to the top. And when they put it in your bowl, you had something. But the Poles, when they were dishing up the soup, they didn't stir it. They gave it you from the top, so all you got was hot water. That was the Poles for you. Anyway.
Were there any exceptions? Or
that was the soup. But if other people dished up, like the Czech people from Czechoslovakia, then they used to stir the soup and you got a little bit of a vegetable or something. I mean, a lot of people that used to last 4 months, 5 months, and they died because they did hard physical work. There was dysentery, there was typhoid, there was malnutrition, there was, you name the illnesses.
And Irene, what did you do during the day?
Well, this is the thing. My mother was working all the time, and I stuck with the people from Holland because they were all born in Holland, but their fathers or mothers were Hungarian. Mm-hmm. So we were kept together. And I forgot to mention that when we came into this hall, they had to take off the ring and they threw the uniform at you. Everybody was given like a little triangle, so they knew exactly who you were. Like there was a red triangle that was stuck on your chest and on your left arm. A black triangle meant you were political. A pink triangle meant you were homosexual. What other triangle? Oh, a green triangle meant you were a murderer.
Wow.
Oh, yes. And they used to know who would get all these sadists, and the people with these positions, like the murderers and that, were given authority over other people. But the Jews had something different. We had, of course, a yellow Magen David, and in the Magen David there was a little U, which in purple, which U stood for Ungar, which means Hungarian in German. That was a Magen David, and there was a number underneath, so when they looked at you, they knew you were a Jew, they knew you were Hungarian, and your number. Nobody was called by their name. You know, they wanted to make you feel like nothing. Nobody was ever called by name, it was by number. And so during the day, I used to be in the barrack because at least it was warm, and I used to play with the other children. I mean, there were no toys. There was nothing. So we used to make up stories. The little girls, I remember, I always wanted to be a fairy and grow wings and fly away. My big thing was to fly over the wall, just to fly away, because you never saw a flower or a blade of grass. You never heard a bird sing, nothing. The walls were so high, you saw nothing, only the sky. And I only realized years, like 50 years later, when I went to Germany, when I went back to the camp, that it was actually a beautiful area with flowers and trees and whatnot, all outside the wall, but not where we were. And of course they didn't have gas chambers until the last 6 months of the war, but they had a crematorium because people were dying all the time, and you saw the flames and the smell. You would wish it on your worst enemy. It was the most terrible smell of burning flesh. And I used to say to my mother, "What are the flames?" And she always turned my head away. "Don't look, Irene, don't look, don't ask." So she was always protecting me as best as she could. And I didn't know until afterwards what it was. And then, of course, there were torture chambers. And we used to hear the screams. And I remember one day the screams were terrible. And some other woman, of course I learned to speak German there because nobody spoke English. And I said to my mother, asked somebody, "What is going on?" And they had apparently caught somebody who they thought was a double agent. And they were pulling out her nails. And the screams. And as I say, years later, when I went back, I mean, they kept the building where the tortures went on, and they've got photos of what they did to people. And they did experiments on people. The commandant of that camp, very few German commandants of concentration camps were actually killed after the war. Most of them went back into German society and carried on doing whatever they were doing, but not Fritz Suren. That was his name. And he was very keen on all the experiments. And they did horrendous experiments on people. It wasn't only in Auschwitz. It was there. And then, of course, every now and again there would be a list and people would be called up. It was called going on transport. Now, there was one woman, a German woman. Now, I'd never seen a fat person in my life. It was the first time. Now, she was a barrack leader. She was a big fat woman with big bosom. And she had a full head of hair, and she had blonde hair with a bun, and it was plaited on the top, typical German, nice-looking woman. Her name was Katie Peters, and for some reason which I will never know, she took a shine to me, maybe because I was blonde and blue-eyed. But she, and we never saw her clapping anybody or doing anything. One day, she calls my mother in, and me and my brother. He says he doesn't remember it. Well, he doesn't, but I remember it. She calls my mother in, and she says, "Look, there's a list with names on. Kraus, Kraus, Kraus." My mother was Rachel Kraus, my brother was Donald Kraus, and I'm Irene Kraus. Spelled K-R-A-U-S-Z, that's the Hungarian way. And she said, "You are supposed to go on transport tomorrow to Auschwitz." Well, what can you say? So my mother never said a word. And then this woman says to my mother, "I'm not letting them take you away." And you know what she did? She took a red pencil and she crossed out Kraus, Kraus, Kraus. And she put 3 other innocent people whom I will never know and who are not here today, and they were sent on transport, and we were left behind. Now, don't tell me that's not luck. That is luck. Now, also, you never looked them full in the face, the guards. You had to look down. It's like a wild animal. You don't look a wild animal in the eyes. You look down. And one day she calls my mother in, and she screams at her, and I'm holding on to my mother for dear life. My brother wasn't there. He'd already been sent to the men's camp. And you never spoke unless spoken to. Eventually, my mother says to her in German, well, my mother knew German because her parents were from Lithuania and they spoke Yiddish, so it was a mixture, but she could manage. So my mother said, "What did I do? What have I done?" And I was terrified they were going to hit my mother. And she says, you won't believe this, she says, "It's bad enough for a little girl like your daughter to be in a terrible place like this, but it's even worse for her to have a birthday and not get a present." Can you believe it? I mean, this woman, I think, was a war criminal. And she's shouting at my mother because I never got a present. And I had, as I say, all my hair. And she opens her drawer and she took out a green satin ribbon. I remember she made a nice big bow in my hair. She said, that is your daughter's birthday present. Now, this same woman who was nice to us, and my mom's sister-in-law was there, my father's brother's wife was there as well in the camp. And after we had left the camp and gone elsewhere, she told us after the war, when we went back to Holland, she said to my mother, this same woman who gave Irene the ribbon, she saw her when the Hungarians came in 1944 from Budapest or wherever. She took two young 16-year-old girls and she strangled them. She was a big woman, she had big hands. And these were skinny people, they were teenagers. No rhyme or reason, she strangled them with her bare hands.
And she killed them?
Of course she killed them.
Wow.
And I remember years later, my husband said to me, Irene, if this woman had to came to South Africa, would you testify against her? And I said, no, I wouldn't, because she saved our lives. She was good to us. She may not have been good to you or to somebody else, but she saved our lives. So I would not have, you don't do that. I would never have testified against her. I remember my husband was a bit shocked at my answer, but then he wasn't there, so he didn't know. Anyway.
So, Irene, I just want to say, maybe because she took such a liking to you, your mother and your,
But why strangle those two girls?
That's too terrible.
And she wasn't bad. I mean, we never saw her ill-treating anybody. We didn't. And then one day, now I must tell you that you could shower once every 6 months. Once in 6 months. Now, a lot of people didn't. But my mother had a thing about cleanliness. And she said, we have to keep clean. And there was like a trough with taps where you could wash yourself. It was cold water, of course, even in the winter. She said, it doesn't matter how cold it is, you have to be clean. Because if your body is clean, then, well, I suppose you wouldn't get a lot of sickness. I don't know what her reasoning was. But anyway, it worked. And I remember I hated it. Not that they gave you a towel. Oh, no. You got washed with cold water, and then you put on the clothes you were wearing before on your wet body. But...
And how often could you wash?
You could wash every day.
But it was cold water?
Well, my mother used to about 3 times a week.
Wow.
But the thing is, we didn't get bitten, and we didn't get a lot of things that a lot of other people got. So again... Then one day there was a Polish woman, and she used to wash the uniform in a big zinc tub for this Katie Peters, the one who gave me the ribbon. She used to wash her uniform, and then she used to dry it, and then she used to iron it. One day she comes to my mother. My mother was amazed for a Pole to be nice to her. She goes up to my mother and she says to her, I wash the uniform. Now, how dirty can it be? Washes it once a week. She said, Irene can come and she can have a bath in the hot water with soap and a proper towel. And I will do this once a week for Irene. Oh, my mother was amazed, and I used to go, and she was very friendly and nice, and she used to sing Polish songs, and I thought she was very nice. And she did this for 3 whole weeks. And then one day, I go there and I have a bath. This time she's not singing, and she dries me, and I put on, the same clothes, of course. And then I was about to walk away back to where my mother, who wasn't there, but she was somewhere else. She says, come, Irene, come. And she calls me over, and she took the hot iron, and she put it on my neck. And I screamed. I mean, a hot iron. And I said to her in German, "Why are you doing this?" And she said, "Because you are nothing but a dirty little Jew." So, of course, that was the end of the baths. And for years, I was, when we went to Rhodesia, my mother, I wore my hair long, and my mother had it removed.
You had a scar?
Of course I had a scar.
It must have been horrendous.
Well, there were worse things going on, but you didn't give in. You had to. That was her. It doesn't mean everybody was like that. But with the food, and of course the worst was the standing for hours and hours and hours outside, and some people couldn't stand it. It was called appel, which means roll call. Some people couldn't stand it, and they threw themselves against the electric fence, and they died a horrible death. And they kept the body there, because that's what happens to you when you try and escape. They kept the body there. You got used to seeing dead people.
You saw this, you could not.
Of course you saw it. Where could you hide? Anyways, I say we always do the games. Then my mother went to see, she had a lot of guts. She went to see the, he calls her over one day, the commandant, and he says to her, "Frau Kraus, I believe you were a school teacher in England." She says, "Yes." He says, "Well, and then I'd like you to teach some of the children." Now, these were Hungarian Jewish children, okay? And my mother says, "Fine." Anyway, he says, "Okay, you'll start tomorrow morning." Well, at least it didn't mean she didn't have to be outside in the freezing cold, schlepping and carrying heavy, what did I say it was? Sleepers. So anyway, she calls all the kids, and they're all sitting around her in a circle on the floor of the barrack. And she didn't have paper, pencil, nothing. So she went back to see him, and she said, "Look, I know I'm a teacher, but can I have some paper and pencils so that the children can draw, that they can do something?" And I wasn't with her when she went back, and he screamed at her. He says, "What do you think? This is a holiday camp. Do something." So what did my mother do? She told them stories. She just told them stories. And she sang songs to them. Never mind, some of them were in English and they didn't understand it. But she did. And she taught me, which I've never forgotten, and I still say it every night when I go to bed, "The Lord is my shepherd," the 23rd Psalm. Wow. She taught it to me in English because she couldn't translate it into Dutch. And I knew it was a prayer, and she said, "You must always say it before you go to bed." And I still say it to this day before I go to bed. And then she used to say, like somebody asked us years later, asked my mother, "Did you pray?" And she said, "No. Except one thing, I used to pray." When you think about it, just think of the word. She said, "I used to ask God to give me strength to get through one more day."
Wow.
One more day, not 2 days, not a week, not a month, because who knew what could happen? Strength for one more day. Yeah.
Very courageous lady, your mother.
She was, and she helped, as I say, a lot of people. Like when they brought this hot coffee, it was like a big, big, big metal thing, and they had 4 women carrying it, 2 on this end, 2 on that end. And when it was my mother's turn, they used to call my aunt up. But my aunt had had a heart condition. God knows how she survived the war. So when they called her up, and it wasn't my mother's turn, my mother used to go instead of my aunt. So she was doing all this extra heavy physical, and my aunt survived the war. I don't know how, but she did. And if she could help anybody with anything, she did. You can't believe the things she did for other people, and people never forgot that.
Irene, can I just mention something? Your mother must have been exceptionally special because the commandant called her by her name, not by her number.
That's right.
So she must have been a very, very special...
Well, she was the only English-speaking person in the camp. Frau Kraus, yeah. Anyway, so she told stories, and I remember she told me once, well, she told stories, I don't know, fairy queens or whatever, and then she told a story about princesses who lived in a palace. Now, some of the kids didn't know what a palace was. So what do you think she said? It's 2 barracks, one on top of another. You know, so that they'd get an idea of the height. Yeah. You had to use your imagination. But anyway, we were there, and then one day, oh, I nearly forgot. I don't know if you noticed when you saw the photos in my bedroom. There's a photo of a Chinese woman, and she's wearing that uniform, and she's got a blanket over her shoulder. This Chinese woman, this is also pure luck. She was her mother was a Belgian, she was born in Belgium, to a Belgian mother and a Chinese father. She spoke 7 languages. She was very, very highly educated. And she was living in France, and she helped to hide British airmen or whoever was flitting around France at the time, and they caught her, and she was sent straight to Auschwitz. But she wasn't in Auschwitz very long. And then she was sent, because, you know, near the end of the war, they started sending people to other camps. Yeah. And quite a few people came from Auschwitz. And how she came to our barrack was also luck. And from the 600 people in that barrack, who did she befriend? My mother.
Wow.
She befriended my mother. And she was unbelievable. She knew what was happening before it even happened. And one day she said to my mother that people can work in Siemens. You couldn't volunteer or anything. They are looking for people to work in Siemens. Now, you're an educated woman. I mean, a lot of the people were not educated. So she said, you're an educated woman. You must somehow go to this person and tell them you were a school teacher and one thing and another, and you would like to work in Siemens because anything was better than the camp. Oh, I forgot to mention, when my mother got to the camp, she said she thought Westerbork, this Dutch camp we were in, was hell. But when she got to Germany, to Ravensbruck, she realized that it was paradise.
Wow.
Yeah, you got the difference. Because at least in Westerbork we did get parcels. You know, my father still had family in Holland who hadn't been taken away. She did get parcels. Oh, and another thing I must mention. One of my father's cousins married a German woman. And the family didn't like her because she was German. And he was Jewish, you know. And she was very blonde and blue-eyed. And they had one child who was very dark like her father. And so the family were not nice to her because their cousin had married this woman. Who was nice to her? My mother. And her little girl was a year older than me, and she used to let her come and play with me in Holland, and she was nice to her, and she made her welcome. The first food parcel we got in that camp came from Annie Kraus. She never forgot that my mother had been good to her, and she sent us parcels regularly in Westerbork. After that, we didn't. And because she was not Jewish and her husband was, they were not taken away. But he was a very stupid man, my father's cousin. He was a very good-looking man, and he liked the ladies, and the ladies liked him. And there was some German woman in Holland who took a shine to him. And anyway, they had a bit of a thing going on. And she said to him one day, if ever you leave me, I will send you to a camp. And he says, no. He says, I won't go. I've got a German wife. She warned him. She said, if ever you leave me. She was besotted by him, God knows why. Anyway, of course, he found somebody else, and he was sent to a labor camp and was never seen again.
Wow.
You know, that was that. Okay, that was him. Now,
Did his wife survive the war?
yeah, well, she was German. Now, just to jump ahead a bit, after the war, before we were liberated, after the war, I mean, I wanted to go back to Holland, and my mother said, we were already in Sweden at the time, she said, everyone I loved is gone. I can never live in Holland again. And then, you know, she had two sisters and a brother in England, and the others were all here in South Africa. So, well, that's another story. We landed up here anyway. But when my mother eventually went back to Holland 10 years after the war, in 1954, she went to Holland. I mean, who was left? Very few people left. One of the first ones she went to see was this Annie, who sent us the parcels. And one of my other cousins had managed to get away while the war was on, and she went to Switzerland. Her father was very wealthy. You could do that if you had a lot of money. And she went to Switzerland, and then after the war she came back, and her husband, my cousin's husband, married, had a very big factory for making curtains. I mean, there were no curtains after the war. And my mother went to speak to him, and she said, listen, Annie Kraus has got a little girl the same age as my Irene. I mean, she was bigger then already. And she was good to us. She sent us parcels. I'd like you to help her. And he says, how can I help her? So my mother said, she was living in one little miserable room. My mother said to her, get her a nice apartment, give her a job in your factory as a seamstress, so that she had a livelihood. And he did. Now my mother wanted to, and this woman never ever forgot that. That's on the strength of sending us a parcel.
And did you keep in touch with her daughter?
Well, I didn't know, because after the war, she went back to Germany, actually. She was German. She went back to Germany, and her daughter married not a Jewish man. She married somebody from, Holland. What was it? Not Indochina. What was that part of China that the Dutch had?
Indonesia.
Indonesia. She married an Indonesian guy. She married him, and they landed up in Australia. But meanwhile, she married 3 times. Sure. And we never heard from her again, but we know she's still around, because my brother found her address, and he sent it, and he wrote to her, and and she's the same age as my brother. She's 89. Yeah.
So Irene, going back to with Siemens, did your mother manage to get
this Chinese woman told her who to contact. Yeah. And all I know is one day my mother says to me, come. Oh no, she went, and apparently she had to put her hands on the table to make sure they didn't shake. I mean, some people, their hands shook and all that, and they wanted to see if you were, if you had dexterity in your fingers. Well, she didn't have thick, fat fingers, did she? I mean, no. She was thin. And they said she could go to Siemens, and she was making little microphones for the German army. She had to screw them in and all that. Now, the thing is, it was a slave labor camp. No children were there. Again, this is luck. Now, my mother's sister-in-law, well, I mean, she wasn't her sister-in-law yet, but she was a woman from Romania who came to Holland because of how bad things were for Jews. And in Holland, she met my father's brother. And then the war came. And anyway, he's the only one who survived the war. And after the war, he married my aunt. So she became my aunt's sister-in-law. So it was my mother and my aunt. And I'm in the middle, trying to be invisible. Children were not there. Anyway, we were in the front. And my mother took chances. You have to take chances. And the door of the barrack opened up. It was a long walk. It was 4 kilometers. And I remember I was little and it was cold. And my mother said to me, I want you to practice walking around the camp, Irene. Practice walking. If you can't walk, we can't go, and it'll be better there. And of course I didn't listen. I didn't want to walk because it was freezing cold, so I stayed in the barrack. But anyway, I managed to walk. And we get there, and the door of the barrack opens, I remember that, and this woman, a very blonde German woman in a smart uniform, "Oh," she says, "there's a little girl here." And my mother says, "Yes, that's my daughter." And then she said to my mother, we couldn't believe it, she said, "Wait, I'm going to bring your daughter a glass of milk." My mother burst into tears, you know. She didn't say no children are allowed. Meanwhile, I was allergic to milk all my life. I couldn't drink milk. You saw I have black tea. I don't have cream. I have nothing with milk. I was allergic. And I couldn't drink milk. It made me vomit. I couldn't. And my mother said, no, she can't drink it. And she said, all right. She says, look, she can come inside, but she's not supposed to be here. She'll have to hide all the time. So for 4 months, I was hiding under the barracks, under the beds. But it was very much better than Ravensbruck. The place was clean, and there weren't so many people in a bunk. There were just 3 in a bunk as opposed to 5 in a bunk. The blankets were clean, and the food was clean. It wasn't that you got more. Maybe a little bit more. I think maybe you got 2 slices of bread in the morning. And my mother used to go to work, and then she came back at about, I don't know, 5:30, 6 in the evening. And then we would be together. And what I did all the time, I don't know. But
you were the only child?
I was the only child there. And, I mean, they took 14 and 15-year-olds, but not little ones. And as I say, and I don't remember how this happened, but I always asked my mother, what did you do? And she said, you know, I'm making microphones. But it's only years after the war that I asked her. And, you know, you had to screw little whatnots. And there was somebody who was watching you all the time. And my mother said, you know, she didn't want to do things for the German war effort. So she thought she would try and sabotage them. So instead of putting 2 screws into a thing, she'd put 1. Or instead of putting 4, she'd put 3. And she did this a few times. And then one day, this woman guard comes up to my mother, and she says, I've been watching you. I know what you are doing. Now, you know, you could be shot for that, eh? She said, just remember that if you get shot, what do you think will happen to your little girl? And my mother just stopped dead. And she said, just remember. So my mother couldn't do it anymore. And then one day we went back to Ravensbruck, and again this Chinese woman said, it's before the end of the war, it was the 28th of April. She said, I don't know how she knew these things. We didn't know. She said that the Swedish Red Cross are coming with buses, and some people will be allowed onto the buses, and you've got to see that you get onto that bus, she said to my mother. So my mother said, well, how can I see? She says, well, you'll have to try and get your name on the list. And I don't know how my mother did that, but she scrounged around and she got her name on the list and my name. And I remember then the war wasn't over yet, eh? We walk out. There were big gates, and there was this horrible German guard there, and she pulled off the Magenta Ved, and she pulled this off, and I kept saying to my mother, are we free? Is it real? Is it real? What's happening? Is it real? I kept saying, is it real? Is it echt? You know, that's Dutch. Is it echt? And my mother said yes. And I kept looking behind me because I thought they were going to come and schlep us back. And then we walked, and there were the buses. And who was standing in front of every bus? A Gestapo man. Because the war wasn't over yet. And he looks at the list, and if your name was on the list, he crossed it off, you could get on the bus. If your name was not on the list, there was one person that my mother knew. She was a Belgian woman, a Christian woman, and she wasn't on the list. And she stood there, and she must have been quite pretty, but she had a doek on, she had no hair. And look, she wasn't Jewish anyway. She looked very Aryan. And she said her name was whatever. And he looks at the list and he pulled her roughly and he pushed her. And she had to go back to the camp. I don't know what happened to her. But my mother said, now I don't know if this was a story or if it happened. My mother said when he pulled her off the bus, my mother saw this woman's hair turn grey.
Wow.
Turn grey, you know, from shock, from fright. We don't know what happened. Anyway, there was a Polish woman, a Jewish woman, who was friendly with my mother. I didn't like her. She was always horrible to us children. But anyway, my mother was friendly to her. And the bus took, I think it was 30 people. And you sat two together. So now you had to fill up one bus and then you went to the next one. So then they said, okay, one seat on this bus and then you get on the next one. So this Polish woman says to my mother, why don't you let your little girl go on that bus and I'll sit next to you on the bus behind? And my mother said, no, my daughter stays with me. And guess what? That bus was bombed.
Wow.
It was bombed because, listen, to me it was a beautiful sight. I saw Berlin burning. And to me it was a beautiful sight. And to see all these people with the wheelbarrows, they weren't thin or emaciated. They were well dressed. All right, they were pushing wheelbarrows. Their homes were burning. I don't know where they were going. And I said to my mother, I still remember, I'm so glad that they are suffering. And she said, don't talk like that. But I saw that bus was bombed. And this woman was killed. I can't say I was sorry because she was horrible to me. You know, when you're a child. And she wanted me to go on that bus. Now, isn't that luck?
It's incredible.
It was luck.
Irene, it's
and
incredible.
then we drove right through this burning city until we got to Denmark.
Now, was this the Count? Did he organize these
Yes,
buses?
he did.
Were these the white...
He was the brother of the King of Sweden, Count Bernadotte. And he organized the buses, but there was apparently somebody else who helped organize it as well. I don't know who.
Were these the white buses?
These were ordinary school buses that were green, and he had them painted white with a red cross because he knew that the Russians were flying over Berlin. And he thought that if they saw a red cross bus...
They won't bomb it.
They won't, but the thing is they did. They didn't. They thought it was a German trick. So quite a few of the buses were bombed.
And not only Jews got onto the buses.
Very few Jews. No, they only took 11,000 Jews from our camp. I didn't know all the 11,000. But 11,000, it was, I told you, Himmler said, take some Jews. And Bernadotte said, why? And he said, well, it'll look better, it'll look good after the war's over that you took Jews as well. And Bernadotte said, but only a few. Only a few. He didn't want to take Jews.
It's amazing because
so that is
the perception is that he was there to save the Jews and he organized specifically to save the Jews.
Look, Sweden, 33,000 people from the camps were rescued by Count Bernadotte. But we were on one of the first buses. It was on the 28th of April. The war, as you know, ended on the 8th of May. So it was 9 days before the end of the war. And afterwards, they rescued people from other camps. But my aunt, the one who was married to my father's brother, well, she's the one who knew about this woman who strangled her. She told us, oh yes, while we were still in Ravensbruck, I'm jumping around a bit now, this is April now, April 45, there were microphones shouting all the time, the Russians are coming, and this, that, the next thing, we want to evacuate, everybody must leave Ravensbruck and go to Bergen-Belsen, which was about 7 or 8 kilometers away, and people were supposed to work to walk there, and it'll be much better, and it's far from the Russians, and they put the fear of the Lord of the Russians up all the people, and a lot of people went, and my aunt went, but my mother, she could walk into a room and she could tell from a vibe, like she'd say, you are not, she'd say to me, that person is not a well-wisher. She'd never met them before. She could tell. I don't know how she could. And one day there was, she's walking along, and outside the fence was this German guard, a man, and you never spoke to them. And my mother took a chance, and she went and she called through the fence, and she said to him, a lot of people are going to Bergen-Belsen. Do you think it's a good idea? And I heard him, and he said to her, is that Dinah's kind? Is meaning me?
Is that your child?
And she said yes. And he said, bleib here.
Wow,
that saved our lives. Because my poor aunt went, and there's somebody I hope to see, she was also from Holland, she was with us, and her mother and her brother went to Bergen-Belsen, and her brother was with my brother, and they went to the men's camp, and this little girl was younger than me. She was about a year younger than me, Emmy, and apparently she told me this years later when I went to Israel. Can you imagine? Well, I mean, there was no food, there was no water, and the water that there was people were dying like flies, and
there was typhus. Typhus was rampant.
Typhus was rampant, and there were rats running around, and it was just horrible. And they didn't know what to do with the bodies, so the bodies were, you must have seen it on films, were just thrown in a heap. And this poor little Emmy saw her mother like a skeleton, just tossed away like a garbage bag. And when I saw her in Israel, she said to me, I've been going to a psychiatrist for 30 years and it's never helped. I've never forgotten that scene. Her father died in Buchenwald, the same place where my father died. And she and her brother and her two brothers survived.
And Frank died in Bergen-Belsen.
Sorry?
And Frank.
What
she
about
was sent
yeah, I know
she
was.
died in Bergen-Belsen.
I know she did.
Yeah. No, there was typhus. They said
no, it was. Do you think we didn't have typhus where we were? There was everything. There was everything. If you didn't succumb, I don't know. That's why when people ask what childhood diseases have you had, I haven't had any. Because think of all the things that I could have gotten in the camp.
Wow.
So that made me immune. The only childhood illness I had, I still remember, I was 4 years old and living in Holland, I got measles. And measles, if you get meningitis, you're gone. And they didn't know much about measles. And I remember my mother put me in the bedroom, and you couldn't have light in the room. The curtains were closed. And I had to stay there. And I remember my father kept saying, when you get better, I'm going to buy you a little motor car. I was very close to my father. He always tucked me in at night. He always told me stories at night. He always used to sing little songs to me. And I got a little blue motor car, like with pedals, and I could flit around. That was when I had measles, but other people got all kinds of things. And they did have a kind of a hospital in the camps, which was called a revier. And there were doctors there, but you weren't supposed to get better. They would put you in there. You would get less food than you had before. You weren't given medicine of any kind, but for some people it was enough just to rest. And the doctors came around after 3 days. If you weren't improved, they used to give you a lethal injection. Kill you. Oh yes, that was in the hospital. And then people were thrown into the crematorium. But by that time there were crematoriums already.
Irene, can I ask, when you saw the buses and when you were on that list and when you left, when they opened the gates of the camp and you went outside and you saw trees or you saw the outside for the first time.
I couldn't believe it.
It must have been an amazing sight for you.
I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that. We hadn't seen anything like that. Yeah.
That's why you said, are we free? Because I'm sure...
Yeah, but is it real? I kept saying, is it real? So...
And you go into the bus, did you see the Count? Was he there or...?
No, we never saw him personally, no.
So where did the buses take you?
They drove us through Berlin.
They drove you through Berlin?
Well, we were in Berlin. They drove us through Berlin, which was burning, into Denmark.
How far was your camp from Berlin?
Well, it was in Berlin. I don't know how many kilometers, but it was in Berlin itself. And then we drove to Denmark. And then from Denmark we got a ferry which took us to Sweden. Now I must tell you about Sweden. Now we get to Sweden and we're on the ferry where this man's father saw anyway. And this I think was bad. A lot of the people who came off the ferry, this man who'd made the documentary sent me a picture of some of the people.
Okay, can you just explain for the viewers who this man who made the documentary?
Oh no, he was a Swedish man.
And his name?
Magnus Gertsen. He made documentaries, and his father was looking at old war films, and he saw a picture of people coming from Denmark on the ferry to Sweden. He was a historian, and he's the one who said to his son, make what you call it, because this little
documentary.
Girl, yes, because this little girl is 8 or 9. She must be alive today.
And you're in the picture.
I'm in the picture, and he phoned us. My husband and I went to Sweden. And they were very nice. He expected me to remember Malmö. I don't remember, because when we did get to Malmö, this is what I think was bad. They took us off the boat. Now, we were all contagious, don't forget. We had to go into quarantine. We were 6 weeks in quarantine. So we got off the boat, and there was a big, big, big white tent, and there were men in the tent. Now, why have men in the tent and all the women had to undress and be naked and go into the showers? I mean, that was not right.
And the men were there?
They were Swedish men. And I remember, and in that film, I've seen it, where you see all the women were standing like this, and with a hand on their crotch. And I copy everybody, and there's a picture of me standing like that as well.
And how old were you now?
I was 9.
You were 9. Only 9 years old.
Yeah, I was 9. Because it was April, and I only turned 10 at the end of the year.
And you remember the men standing?
Well, it didn't worry me that they were there, but the women didn't like it. And anyway, then we were showered. They gave you a towel and soap. Everybody had a shower. And then with the towel around you, you went into another tent, and there were rows and rows of dresses and clothes. And a lot of the people picked clothes. You could pick 2 dresses and shoes and underwear and whatnot. And I remember my mother was quite conservative, and she picked a navy dress with a white collar. And I picked a dress with very bright colours, all little coloured checks. And in all the photos, you see me with that. And then they took us, because we were in quarantine, to a museum. It was a natural history museum, because where were they going to put all these people? They cleared out a lot of the exhibits. And we were there, and didn't have a bed. Everyone was disappointed. There were straw mattresses on the floor, because we were contagious, with paper sheets, and every day they burnt them. We were contagious. God knows what we had, but we were all contagious. And then we stayed in this museum, and at that time, I was the only little girl there. I mean, afterwards other people came, but at that time I was there, and they made an enormous fuss of me, and they gave me dolls, and they were very nice. And
Did the Swedes, I know you were still in
No, the
quarantine,
Swedes were very nice.
but did they come and visit or?
No, they did. No, the Swedes who were working there, they were doctors. And I remember when everybody was looking forward to lovely food. Oh, and the disappointment. When you got to the dining room, you had to hold your hand out like this. And they put in vitamin pills so they put in calcium and I don't know what else. Because, we were all... And I remember I couldn't swallow it, and I'm standing there and I'm trying to swallow it, and he kept saying to me, and they all spoke German, they said, if you don't swallow the vitamin, you can't have your food. And then, of course, we had nice food, but not big quantities, because your tummy couldn't take it. Like it would be a little soup with a bit of meat in it, or vegetables, small quantities. But they were very, very nice. And then when we came out of quarantine, we went to like a rehabilitation center in a place called Gothenburg, and it was in a forest, and I've never seen anything so beautiful. They were all pine trees, and all the snow was on them, and we were staying in like a wooden cabin, and it was lovely, and playing in the snow. I remember that very clearly. And then we went back to Malmö, and by now this is like 3 months later, because we were 6 weeks in quarantine and then quite a while in this rehabilitation center, and now people wanted to go home. And they had a hall, and the Germans kept very good records, and there was they gave everybody a sheet with names on. And my mother looked at the sheet, and all she said to me was, Irene, a lot of your cousins and uncles are gone. But she didn't say dead. She said they are gone. But she didn't say anything about my father. And then she didn't cry. And then she says, stay here. I'm just going to go over there. And she went into a corner. And she told me this years later, she must have had a good cry because my father's name was on it. But you know that she never told me my father had died. Never told me. And now people wanted to go home.
How did you find out, or when did you find out about it?
No, they had lists of people. The Germans had lists.
And your brother Don?
No, and then she still said, but your brother's name is not on the list, so he must be all right. Because he was rescued by the Americans and then he went back to Holland. And then there was like a big hall. People wanted to go home. So they had like French authorities, and the French women came and gave their particulars, and they were told when they could go, and the Poles and the Dutch and everybody. And now my mother, she was born British, don't forget, married in Britain. Her parents, although they came from Lithuania, had come to England in 1850 or 60, and they were naturalized British. I couldn't understand how, because they only spoke Yiddish. They never spoke English. My mom said they used to talk English to her parents, and they answered them in Yiddish. But they never ever, they couldn't read or write in English. But anyway, that was that generation. So now there were these British, they were disgusting. I mean, all the others were sympathetic and nice. And my mother and I are there and looking at the papers, and they said to my mother, well, what can we do for you? And she says, well, I want to go back to Britain. And they said, England, but you are Hungarian. She said, no, I'm British born, of British naturalized parents. I was married in Britain and everything, you know. She said, and they said, yes, but you married a Hungarian. So they said, well, you shouldn't have married a foreigner then, should you? You don't say that to a person who's... That's the British for you. So unsympathetic, not a nice word.
Especially after the war.
And she wouldn't accept... My mother didn't take anything lying down. She didn't say anything. And we're still in Sweden, and she had her sister. You know, she was one of 10. I told you, 8 sisters and 2 brothers. And her one sister was a clerk for the Home Office, I don't know, some office in London. That was my mom's favourite sister, who was just 2 years older than her. And my mother wrote to her and she said they want to send me to Hungary. And she said to these British, I've never been to Hungary. My husband left Hungary because of anti-Semitism. I don't speak the language. There's nobody there. How can you send me there? And that's when they made that remark. Anyway, my mom writes to my aunt. You know what my aunt did? She wrote to Winston Churchill.
Wow.
That was my aunt. But my mom, who else would? And she gave all the details. And when she wrote to Churchill, my aunt sent my mother's British birth certificate, her British marriage certificate, and everything to prove that she was British born and that she was only Hungarian through her marriage. And she wrote this long letter, and Churchill replied that they would take it under consideration, that she could come back to England, but she would have to be renaturalized British. And because my brother and I were under 16, we would automatically become British subjects as well. So anyway, we were eventually allowed, and the family here, because my mother had 7 members of her siblings living here in South Africa, and they all sent money to England, and we stayed in a lovely house in Margate by the sea for a year until the papers came through. They were very good to us, I must say. And my uncle wrote her brother, and he said, you're going to be as far away from Europe as you can be. The skies are blue, and there are no wars here. It's a lovely climate. You'll be safe. Come here. You don't have to go to Europe again. And my mother wouldn't go for 10 years. But then she did go back to Holland, as I say. And after that she traveled. But then we stayed here, and she was here, I think, not even a month. She got a job as a school teacher straight away.
Irene, can I ask, when did you reunite with your brother? And
when we were in England, he was on a death march. He was rescued by the Americans. He was on a death march and he went to Holland. And on the death march, he met people who had been in the camp where my father and his brothers were. And they told him.
In Buchenwald?
Yes, not my brother, these people on the death march. And they told him about my father. And he thought, well, if my father didn't survive, how on earth could my mother and I survive? And he was convinced that we weren't there. But we had neighbors who were very good friends, Christian people. He was in the resistance, actually. And he went there. And he opened the door, and this woman didn't recognize my brother, you know. And she just looked at him and looked at him. And she called her husband, Pete. She said, Pete, look, it's Don Kraus. And this is also pure luck. She said, Don, we got a postcard from your mother and your sister. They are both safe in England. Can you believe it?
It's unbelievable.
And then he wasn't well, and then he came to England, and we all stayed.
Okay, now I just want to ask you, when he came to England and your mother saw her son and you saw your brother for the first time, it must have been incredibly emotional.
It was very emotional. But nobody said anything about my father. And to that, I'll never forgive my mother for that, never. Do you know how I found out? Now, I'd never been to school, don't forget.
Yeah.
I mean, I was taken out of nursery school, then I was in one camp, then I was in another camp. And when we were in England, in England, my mother said I should go to school. And she said to me, we've got to start speaking English. And I said, no, it's not my language, I'm only talking Dutch. But my mother was talking to me in English, so I did understand. You've got to go to school. I didn't know what was going on. Anyway, one day I come back from school. And I said to my mother, there's going to be a concert and I'm going to be a fairy. My mother could sew very well. So I said that you must make me a pink dress and wings. And I was very happy with wings. And my mother made me this beautiful dress. Anyway, when we pitch up for the so-called concert, my mother is there as well. And she takes one look and she says to the teacher, my daughter's not going to be in the concert. It wasn't a concert. They wanted me to be the Virgin Mary because I was the blondest child. So my mother said, no, we are Jewish, and my daughter can't be the Virgin Mary and, and sing songs to Jesus and all that. So that didn't make me very popular. So
Were there any other Jewish kids in the school?
No, I was the only Jewish child in the school. So my mother pulled me out of school, and then she put me in another school, which wasn't a bad school, and except there was one incident. Now my English was still pretty poor, and I don't know what it was. There was a gate, and everybody wanted to be the last one to close the gate. I don't know why. And now it was my turn, and I was so excited. And I ran to close the gate, and some ghastly little English girl came, and she pushed me away. And she said, no, I'm closing the gate, you bloody little Jew. That I understood. And I saw red. Now, I've never considered myself violent, but maybe I've got violent tendencies. I wasn't going to have this. This is only a few months after I got out the camp. And she'd already pushed me onto the ground. But then I went and I pushed her face down, and I took her head and I banged it and I banged it and I banged it on the floor. And the teachers came out screaming, and her head was bleeding, and they phoned my mother and they said, your daughter has criminal tendencies. We don't want her in this school. So I was kicked out of school. So my mother was a teacher. So who taught me to read and write? My mother.
And you went in school?
I didn't go back to school. But then now we come to South Africa.
How old were you when you came to South Africa?
10. We came in 1946. We came in September. It was Standard 3. Now, I'd never been to a proper school, Anyway, look, I must say it was hard because they laugh at you when you talk with an accent. And anyway, that was Standard 3. I didn't do terribly well. And what was it you learn in Standard 3? Who remembers? It's like grade 5 now. My little grandson's in grade 5. But it was a lovely school. It was Observatory Girls.
Gee, okay.
I was there, and then I was there for Standard 4 and Standard 5. And then I went to Bernadotte Park for 1 year. And then my mother was transferred to Rhodesia. Because, as a school teacher, it was hard for her to support both my brother and myself. She wasn't earning that much.
Did your mother ever get remarried?
Never. And she had a lot of opportunities, She didn't. But my mother could always put her hand to anything. She couldn't earn enough as a teacher. She would do something else. No trouble to her. She took a course in pattern making. And she got a job in a factory making patterns. And she was earning nice money. And then my uncle, her brother, had a factory in Rhodesia. And he said to my mother, come to Rhodesia. Irene can carry on at high school and you can make patterns. And, she earned very nicely, and we were living in Bulawayo. And I matriculated there. But I found it very anti-Semitic.
You found it?
The school. It was a top school. It was called Evelyn Girls. They had 1,000 girls. 30 of them were Jewish. Nobody thought I was Jewish with a name like Kraus. And I coped, But the thing is, and I played with other girls who weren't Jewish. There was no problem, We skipped in the playground and everything was lovely. And I went to them for lunch and they came to me for lunch, and everything was lovely until September. What's in September? Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So one day the teacher says, there's going to be a test on Wednesday, blah, 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 biology, which was my worst subject anyway. And make sure that you come early and on time. So I put my hand up. I said, excuse me, miss. I still remember her, Mrs. Hancock, horrible woman. I said, I won't be able to come to school on Wednesday. Oh, she says, well, we all know biology is not your best subject, Irene, but you still have to write the test. I said, no, I can't come because it's a Jewish holiday. So she said, so why is that your problem? I said, because I'm Jewish. Those girls who I'd been friendly with for 6 months faded into the wallpaper. They wouldn't talk to me. They wouldn't play with me. I was sat in the playground all by myself. Nobody would talk to me. It was too terrible. I was very miserable. And this went on for a week, and then slowly, somebody must have said, "Oh, Irene is Jewish." And then 3 or 4 girls from another classroom came, and then I was friendly with them. But those Christian girls were not.
And the other Jewish girls in the school, did they?
No, well, they didn't have a problem. And then afterwards I found out that, in the morning you had to have prayers. And it was a Church of England, everybody knelt on the ground. I'm going to kneel. No way. So I wouldn't kneel. I stood at the back of the hall and I stood up and everybody shouted, "Sit down, kneel, you can't stand, we're having prayers." And I said, "I don't kneel." I said, "In my religion we don't kneel."
Wow.
No, I wasn't going to let them.
But there were other Jewish girls in the school?
Oh, they knelt.
They knelt.
Oh, they were dead scared.
But were they friendly with you when the other girls were?
No, they were friendly with them. They kept saying, "Irene, don't draw attention to yourself, blah, blah, blah." But listen, after what I'd been through, I wasn't scared of anybody. No way. Anyway, and then afterwards, the rabbi was going to give new Old Testament lessons, so we went to that classroom. And he was an old rabbi, he fell asleep after time. It was a bit of a waste. So we used to sit and chat. And then I went back to class, and I was friendly with those girls. And look, it was a nice Jewish community, in Bulawayo. So,
and Irene, can I ask, with the other Jewish girls, or even the non-Jewish girls that you maybe were friendly with, did you ever relate what happened to you in Europe in the camps?
Well, when I came here, no, it was in Rhodesia already. Everybody says, "What does your mother do? What does your father do?" And I said, "I know my father died in a concentration camp." So they said, "Oh, is that a special kind of holiday camp?"
Wow.
Jewish girls, hey?
They didn't know.
And then I realized that they would never understand. So I said, "No, he was sick and he died." How did I find out he died? Which I still say my mother was wrong. We were in Rhodesia, and I'm sitting, I don't know, we always had a cat. And I had the cat on my lap, and we used to listen to Hits of the Week from Mozambique. The LM, I still listen to LM radio. And I'm sitting there with the cat on my lap and everything else, and listening to the music. And then my brother walks in and he says, "What are you doing?" I said, "No, I'm just listening to the radio." And then I said to him, "I've been worried about Dad." And he says, "What?" I said, "Well, we haven't seen him for a long time." Now this is 1951. It's 11 years after the war, 1951. I said, "He doesn't know we're in Rhodesia. He doesn't know this flat. How will he find us? How will he know where we are? Who's going to tell him?" And my brother just looked at me and he said, "Irene, he is not coming back. He died in 1945. And I said, "Why did nobody tell me?" He said, "I thought Mom told you." She wouldn't tell me. I think all her life she was always trying to protect me. She wouldn't tell me.
That must have been devastating years to you.
Well, I couldn't cry. You can't cry 11 years later. Yeah. That was pretty awful. That was awful. But now I must tell you, 2.5 years ago, I get the invitation from Siemens to go there. And then I understood why my mother wouldn't talk. She wouldn't. She'd always say, "You don't remember, you lucky girl." I went to where Siemens was, and they told me, all right, the barracks, I must say it saved us, because when you saw the other people who came out the camps, they were much thinner than us, and their clothes were filthy and dirty, and I'm still in this ridiculous thing that I wore for 3 years, the little shoes that I wore when I was 6. But look, at least I didn't look bad like them. And my mother was thin, but not emaciated. And it's because Siemens was clean, and although there wasn't much food, it was better food. If they gave you soup, there would be a few little veggies in the soup. And I think once a week you got meat. I don't know what meat it was. I don't want to think about that. But my brother said he thinks it was horse meat. But just to give you an idea of Siemens, there was a woman walking to Siemens, and near Siemens there was like an open ground, and there were pigs running around there, and they throw like, what do you call it, corn of the cob, you know, mealie husks.
Yeah.
They threw it there, and this woman was starving. And she ran out of the line. You had to always walk in a line. Ran out of the line and took one of these things that the pigs had left on the ground, and she began to eat it. And one of the German guards saw her, pulled her by her hair, and shot her there and then on the spot, and dragged her all along the muddy road back to Ravensbruck, whoosh, up the chimney. That was Siemens.
Did you see this?
No, I didn't see it.
But it's well known, it's documented.
It was told by one of the German people there. You didn't put a foot wrong. No, there was no... But I must say that then when I went back there with David, with my son in England, and he explained about the work that the women did. Okay, you made the thingamies and all that, but the conditions were bad. They started work at 6 in the morning, and they worked till 12. You were not allowed to go to the toilet until they gave you a half an hour. And a lot of the people messed themselves. You were not allowed to leave, so they messed themselves. So it couldn't have smelt so very nice. Then you had a half an hour. They didn't get lunch either. And I don't know what they did in that half an hour. Maybe went to the toilet or tried to clean up. And then they worked through till 6 o'clock. And then they got whatever there was to eat. But apparently there were, some, it depended who was on duty in the factory. Some of the people, if they thought they weren't working fast enough, they used to smash the fist into their face. Or a favourite thing was they pulled you back by your hair and they hit you under the nose. You know, that can break your
nose. Okay.
But it didn't happen to my mother, luckily. And after that woman saw that what she was doing with the screws, she didn't put a foot wrong because she was frightened what would happen. But conditions there were very, very bad. And quite a lot of people died, and not that I saw it, but if they died, they went back to the camp.
And does the barracks still exist as it was?
No. You see, don't forget, after the war, the Russians liberated the camp. And they took over all the barracks in the camp that were in Ravensbruck, and the barracks from Siemens as well. But they were wooden, and there were rats and all sorts of things. And the Russians, I suppose they were also getting sick, so the Russians burnt all the barracks down, which was, I suppose, a good thing to do. And they burnt all the barracks where the people worked in Siemens as well. So where the barracks were, they had just put like little markers so you could see. And I remember this man said to me, your mother was in barrack number 5 where she was working. But they said that when we come back again, they are going to rebuild 1 or 2 of the barracks to show you what it was like and what the conditions were like. Because
Irene, was it very difficult to go back to Germany? Your first time when you went back?
The first time I went back, well, when I was told I could come, I phoned David in England. I said, David, I can't do this alone. You must come with me. And David, I travelled, how did I go? I travelled from here to London, met David in London, and then we went to Stuttgart, and from Stuttgart we went on to Berlin.
I just want to mention to our viewers that your son David and I were in the same class together. We were on PIN together, but your son is a psychiatrist.
Yeah, no, I couldn't have done it.
And I think it must have been a tremendous help because he's...
It was. And they met us at the gate with a big placard. And then when we got to Ravensbruck, I thought I was going to pass out. And, they've got the wall there still. And you had to, but they didn't have the big gates, and they had, well, the wall was very wide, like 12 foot wide. I mean, the where the gate would have been.
Mm-hmm.
And of course they had taken off all the electric fence, and you didn't see the guys with the guns on the, they weren't
Watchtowers.
Watchtowers, yes, they were not there, of course, anymore. And now, it sounds odd, it was open. There was, you could have 10 people walking across to walk into the camp. And I said to David, I can't take that step. How will I get out of here? And David said, look, Mum, there's a gate, there's a gate, there's a gate, there's a gate. There are 6 gates. There are no barbed wires. You can go out from any one of them, and I'm right next to you. I couldn't take that step. I couldn't.
And Irene, you could never have done this by yourself.
I wouldn't have done it by myself, no. Even now when I go, and I've gone now, I'll go with 2 sons, I still find that first step very hard to
And
take.
is there a museum in Ravensbruck?
No, what they've done is, they've got a very big museum, and they've got all sorts of things, like the beds you slept on and the bowls, and photos of this, that, and the next thing, and you can get the whole history of the camp. And then they had all these terrible statues of these emaciated people, which was done by a very good sculptor. But it's 75 years now, and from the rain, the statues have all become, the
Rusted,
sculptures, yeah. So they haven't got it. It was much more effective when you walked in and you saw these statues, because then you think, gosh, I look like that. Or I look like that, or I look like that. Now they've taken them all inside, so it's not the same.
But Irene, when you went back, it must have been exceptionally difficult. The memories must have flooded in.
They did. They came swarming back. They did come swarming back. And then they have a series of lectures when you go. You don't just go and wander around. They have a whole lot. First of all, I was interviewed by German television, and then they had lectures, and there were people from all different countries who were in the camp. And the bloody Poles, ghastly. When I first went into the dining room, which was open, this is not in Ravensbruck, it was like a little spa that was about 2 kilometers away, which is an ordinary spa for people, but they opened it up for us. And they had all these salads and whatnot, and they had big tables. Now, it's funny, you people sit with people So I sat with the Dutch, and the Poles sat with the Poles, and everybody sat in their little groups. And anyway, there was a table with the most beautiful big green apples, and I'm walking there with Gideon. And David was talking to somebody behind me, and Gideon says, he'll never forget this. I put my hand out. Now, it was a big bowl. I don't know if you saw my bowl of fruit there.
It's very big.
A big bowl. There must have been 20 apples. All I wanted was one miserable bloody apple. Now, when I first when I first walked in, the Poles all smiled at me, and I smiled at them, but I didn't know them. But afterwards, David was talking to somebody. Then I come back with David and with Gideon, and they decided in Ravensbruck they're going to wear a kippah. The minute I walked in with my 2 sons with a kippah, then you saw a true Polak. They looked at me as if they were daggers. And now I want to take an apple, and this woman knocks my hand away. She knocks my hand away. I thought, no bloody Polak's going to do that to me. Now, I don't speak the language, so I just pulled a whole bowl of apples towards me. And I took an apple, and I said to David and Gideon, even if you don't eat the bloody apple, take it. I don't want the Polacks to have all of it. They were so unpleasant. As I say, we could only eat the fruit, the salads, because everything was pork. So we used to have bread. We ate a lot.
But you saw, as soon as they saw where the Amilcar...
That was it. And they were in there with the same conditions.
It's incredible.
They are the same. And right, they were older than me, most of them. I'm hoping when I go now that most of them will be dead. because this time they're not putting us up at the spa. They're putting us up at a hotel, which I don't understand.
And when are you going? When is the...
Supposed to leave, it's a 4-day thing. Before it was a full week. Anyway, it's 4 days, and they put you up at a hotel, and they've planned it. It's going to be a state banquet, and all the big machers from Germany are coming. Look, it is 75 years.
This is the 75th anniversary of the liberation.
Yeah, I know, and of our camp as well. But it should have been on the 28th. That's when we were liberated, and the 29th when the Russians liberated the camp. But now they've moved it forward they've moved it back to the 16th. Nothing happened on the 16th. And Gideon can't even travel with me because he's going to be in Pesach, in Israel for Pesach.
So who's going with you?
Nobody. I'm going to travel alone, so I'm also a nervous wreck. I'll be traveling alone, but I want a flight to England, and then David must come. I'm not stepping into Germany by myself, no way. No way. I know it sounds silly, but I can't do that again. So I'll do that. So I've been emailing them up and down and down and up.
So Irene, I just want to ask, if you could, what you've only gone through, but what message would you give to this generation and the next generation and future generations?
That you can't live with hate. You cannot live with hate, because hate is like a sore that doesn't heal. I've got all my memories. I'll never forgive what they did. I'll never forget what they did.
And you had nightmares
for 20 years. And the worst of it was, I used to wake up in the night apparently screaming, and my husband would shake me and say, Irene, it's all right, you here. And I'd look and I'd see where I was, and what's the first thing I did? I ran into the 4 bedrooms to make sure that all my children were there. I knew we were in South Africa, but it was something in me. I had to see that my children were there. And the nightmares were not just the Germans coming after me, it was the Germans behind me. And then I had my children with me, and there were Germans there. The camp was there. And in my nightmare, this is the worst in my whole life, I knew I was alone. And who was going to protect my children? Where could we go? What could we do? Where would I find food? I couldn't turn back because they were behind me. And in front of me was the camp. And I'm in the middle. Oh, that nightmare. Those nightmares were horrible. Horrible. I went to see a psychiatrist afterwards,
And look, your son became a psychiatrist.
Yes. No, I went afterwards.
And Irene, when did you start speaking publicly about your experiences?
I wouldn't talk about it at all.
For how many years?
It started, when I went to see the psychiatrist, he said to me, the only way, I said, I can't talk about it. And he said, but that's why you're having the nightmares. And you know what he got me to do? I don't know if you would have ever heard of him. He was a very well-known Dr. Zalman Wolf, he was.
I've heard the name.
Oh, he's long gone, past. But anyway, he said, I came there, and he'd sit opposite me. He'd say, okay, now tell me. And in the beginning, I couldn't talk. I just cried. And he said, okay, I'll see you on Thursday. Came on Thursday, and then I could talk a little bit. And as I spoke, he took notes. Okay. And then he said to me, okay, I want you to go home. Can you type? I said, of course. He said, I want you to go home and I want you to type everything you told me. So that means I spoke to him once. Now I type it out at home. That's twice. Now I had to bring what I had typed to him and read it aloud to him. So I was doing this 3 times, and we did that for 6 months, twice a week for 6 months. Anyway, then one day I go there. It's a Tuesday, and I said, Dr. Wolf, I'll see you again on Thursday at 2:30. And he says, no, you won't. And I said, oh, are you going on holiday? He says, you won't have any more nightmares, my girl. And he was right. I never had another nightmare. And he said to me, I want you to read it. He says, if you don't want to talk about it, you don't have to. But he says, I think you should read about it. You must know what happened apart from what happened to you. Read as much as you can and don't talk about it until you feel you're ready. I said, when will I be ready? He says, I don't know. I don't know. And then my daughter married an American, and she's living in America, and my husband and I went to visit her, and we were sitting and having coffee, my daughter and my son-in-law and I, and my husband sees a little video shop. This is, of all places, Tucson, Arizona. It's a tiny little place. She was at university there. And he comes back with a stack of videos. I said, Lester, we're going back to South Africa. Why are you getting videos? And he says, look at them. They were all on the different camps.
Sure.
Do you know that he couldn't watch them? He couldn't watch them. He couldn't bear it if I spoke about it. He got very upset. And I invited people. I had Ronnie Mink, I had my brother, and I had friends, and I said, come, we'll have tea and coffee first, because after you see a film like that, you don't want to eat.
Yeah.
So we had a little snack, and then I'd show the film, and my husband would run upstairs. He couldn't watch it. He couldn't watch it. I've got half of them here. I haven't shown them. I haven't.
And when did you tell your children?
Well, in snips, little bits here and there. My mother told them a little bit. And then when David was older, he would talk to my mother. She would talk to him. She was living with us. My mother lived with me for 17 years while my kids were small. 14 years, sorry. And I'd go into the kitchen, make tea, whatever, come back with a tray, and I'd see her talking to David, and he had a little tape recorder. The minute she saw me, she stopped talking.
She still wanted to protect you.
Me. And I said to David, what did Gran tell you? And then he would tell me things that she'd never told me. But I think it was wrong of her. I mean, I was married with children, and I didn't remember. There's a lot of things I didn't remember, and it worries me. It worried me. Oh, and I didn't tell you something else that happened in the camp. Luck. There was a German guard, and whenever she saw me, she used to stare at me. She never said a word. She used to just stare at me all the time. It was a bit unnerving, but anyway, they could do what they wanted. And one day, when my mother was still schlepping the sleepers, she says to my mother, I'm going to take that girl, I'm going to take your daughter away from you. I'm going to adopt her and bring her up as a pure Aryan, a little German Aryan. Nobody will think she's Jewish. And my mother said, how can you take her away from me? And she said, you're a Jew, you can do nothing, and I will do it. Well, you were in a situation, it was a no-win situation. And all my mother, she didn't tell me that, all my mother said to me was, if ever you see that guard, go into the barrack, try and hide, don't let her see you. And I didn't understand why. She didn't tell me. She only told me after the war. And all the time my mother is waiting for this woman to take me away and talk about luck. 4 days later, she was transferred to another camp.
Wow.
Do you think she wouldn't have taken me? It's strange, eh? There's lots of things.
So, Irene, this is...
Lots of horrible things.
I just want to...
So my message is, don't hate. You can't live with hate. There are good Germans, there were bad Germans, and I believe that God gave everybody a choice between good and evil, and it's up to them what they choose to do. But you cannot live with hate, and that is my message. Can't live with hate.
So I just want to... And do you feel very positive? We went through so much anti-Semitism, and now we see it's resurged, unfortunately, in many countries. I find it very
upsetting. Nothing here, nothing much here, I must say. But I know that my 2 sons go to the Great Park Shul, and they're often on duty. They have guards, outside the shul.
You never used to.
No, they do now, I promise you. They do now. There's even guards at the schools, at King David's School. When you were at school, they didn't have those high walls, did they? They do now.
But Irene,
Would you like another sandwich?
no, Irene, I just want to thank you so much. This has been one of the greatest honors and privilege
Well, that's very
to
nice
be
of
with
you.
you,
Nice of
to
you
hear your
too.
story, and not your story, to hear your your life.
Look, my mother said you don't look back in life, you look forward. And I've always been a cheerful person. I've never had nightmares again.
You're so positive.
You have
and
to
what,
be
what
positive.
you've gone through and what you've seen
And I
in your
try and
life.
see the best in everything.
Wow, well,
Unfortunately, my brother doesn't. He is very negative. He's very self-absorbed, and he just talks Holocaust all the time.
but you're very positive, and your attitude is, I must tell you, you are someone that, please God, we can all strive to emulate. Really,
Well-
what you've gone through, and you are smiling, and you brought up a beautiful family. I know your son. I was at school with
Well, I
him.
showed you the photo of the four of
It's
them.
wonderful. But our wish is that you should just have Mazel and Bracha
Thank you so
till
much.
120. You said many times that it was luck.
It was
Well,
luck.
I believe it's Mina Shemaim. It's
Yes.
all.
Yes, I know you
It's
do.
Mina Shemaim, but luck, Mina Shemaim, whatever. But thank God you're alive.
Yeah.
Thank God.
And if it wasn't for my mom,
You're a very courageous mother. And can we show the picture of your very beautiful mother?
oh yes,
But she was a
absolutely.
very courageous lady.
She was, and she did every.
And she
but
protected
she
you.
was very positive.
And
But she protected me too much. Even when I'm married, not to talk about things that's,
she must have loved you very dearly.
I
But
couldn't
Irene,
have got through without
it's
her.
been the greatest honor, and I'd may have streamed till 120 only with Mazel Bracha.
Don't wish me 120.
No, in good health, in very good health, in only good health, and only Mazel and Bracha.
Well, thank you for taking the
And,
time.
It's
I
been
do
the greatest.
appreciate it.
It's been the greatest
and I
honor
wish
and
you
privilege.
well.
Thank you
I
so
wish
much.
you all well.
But
and
Irene,
and can
really,
I offer you some
don't
other
worry,
coffee?
I'm all good. But Irene, I just want to really, from the bottom of my heart, I really want to thank you.
Now, is there any way